September 13, 1944. A farm road east of the Moselle River, near a village called Dieu-Loir, in northeastern France. Before the sun is fully up, Colonel Bruce Clarke's Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division is pushing through a bridgehead that the 80th Infantry Division clawed out of the eastern riverbank the night before. The bridgehead is barely a mile deep. By every calculation being made at the headquarters of the German First Army, it is too shallow, too fresh, and too exposed to support armoured exploitation for at least another day. Combat Command A did not wait another day. At the headquarters of General Otto von Knobelsdorff, the morning intelligence summary is being completed. Knobelsdorff was not a cautious or slow-thinking officer. He had led the 19th Panzer Division into Russia in the summer of 1941, fought it to the outskirts of Moscow, and spent the following 2 years commanding the 48th Panzer Corps through the bloodiest armoured battles the Eastern Front produced, including the operations around Belgorod and the southern sector of the Kursk offensive in July 1943. He had taken command of First Army just days earlier on September 6th, stepping directly off a train from the Eastern Front. He was exactly the kind of aggressive, battle-hardened panzer commander the German army trusted to stabilize a crisis front. The intelligence summary his staff is completing assesses the Dieu-Loir bridgehead as a secondary effort. It judges the main American thrust as falling either at Metz to the north or south of Nancy. It recommends holding current positions and awaiting further observation before committing reserves. By the time that summary reaches the officers who need to act on it, Clarke's armour is already deep in the German rear, heading for Chateau Salins. By the time those officers issue orders in response, the roads they are ordering units to hold are already behind American lines. 2 days later, Nancy itself falls, encircled and abandoned before a single house-to-house fight becomes necessary. Not one German unit was outgunned at Dieu-Loir. Not one German position was overrun by a superior weapon. What happened in those 48 hours was something the German army had spent 80 years building a doctrine to prevent and had never fully solved. Their orders were arriving one battle too late. Their reserves were being sent to positions the Americans had already left. Their command system, the finest in the world by the measure of every previous year of the war, was being defeated not by firepower but by pace. This is the story of how that happened, what the German commanders who lived through it said about it afterward, and why the lesson it produced is still at the center of how American officers are trained today. It is also an honest story, which means it includes the parts where Patton stopped doing the thing that made him dangerous, and what the German generals said about that too. If this kind of history matters to you, take a moment right now to subscribe and hit the like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps these stories reach the people who want them. Here is what you need to understand about the Third Army before you can understand Lorraine. The army that Patton took operational at noon on August 1st, 1944, in a Norman orchard had been systematically hidden from the Germans for months. While First Army under General Courtney Hodges fought its way through the Norman hedgerows, Patton was nominally attached on paper to a fictional formation called the 1st United States Army Group. That phantom force was designed to convince Hitler that the main Allied landing was still coming at Pas-de-Calais, and that Patton was commanding the army that would deliver it. The deception held so effectively that entire German armoured divisions sat idle north of the Seine for weeks after D-Day, waiting for an assault that would never come. When Patton finally appeared, it was real, it was operational, and it moved at a speed the German command system had never encountered from an American formation. In the next 30 days, Third Army did something no American army had done before. It moved in 4 directions simultaneously: south to the Loire River, west into Brittany, north toward Argentan to help close the Falaise pocket, and east, relentlessly east, toward the Seine and what lay beyond it. By August 25th, Allied armoured columns had advanced up to 400 miles inland, well ahead of the planning schedule for Operation Overlord, which had assumed 90 days would be needed to reach the line reached in 79. On August 31st, Patton's cavalry seized intact bridges over the Meuse River at Verdun and Commercy. At Verdun, where in 1916 both sides had lost 300,000 men in a battle whose front line shifted by less than 5 kilometers over 10 months of fighting. But here is the part the legend tends to omit. The army that had moved 400 miles in 4 weeks was consuming fuel at a rate its own supply system could not match. By the end of August, The combined daily fuel demand of Third Army and Hodges's First Army was approaching 800,000 gallons. The supply system, still running tankers and trucks all the way from the port of Cherbourg, because the captured port of Antwerp was not yet operational, could not deliver it. Hugh Cole's official United States Army history of the Lorraine campaign records that on August 30th, Third Army's actual gasoline receipts amounted to 31,975 gallons, against an estimated daily need of roughly 400,000 gallons. The shortfall was not a rounding error. It was an order of magnitude. The American answer to that problem was the Red Ball Express, a round-the-clock trucking operation conceived in a 36-hour planning session and launched on August 25, 1944. At its peak, it ran 5,958 vehicles on a dedicated one-way circuit between the Normandy supply depots and the forward supply points near the front. Over its 83 days of operation, it delivered 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations. Nearly 75% of its drivers were African American, men serving in a segregated army that asked them to drive through the night without headlights on roads beaten to rubble by the weight of the war. They kept Patton moving longer than anyone had a right to expect. But even they could not close a gap that wide for long, and for 5 critical days at the start of September, Third Army stood essentially idle at the Meuse, waiting for gasoline that was still in drums back in Normandy. Those 5 days mattered more than most popular accounts of Lorraine acknowledge. The German army, which had been running in something close to organizational panic since the Falaise disaster in August, used that pause to do the one thing an offensive at operational tempo is supposed to deny the enemy. It reconstituted. German engineers fortified the Moselle crossings. Fresh Volksgrenadier divisions, rushed from Germany under Hitler's emergency conscription program, began filling gaps in the line. Armored reserves were moved forward. The disorganized retreat that had swept 500 miles across France began to harden back into something resembling a coherent defense. This is the first truth about the Lorraine campaign that the popular version tends to get wrong. Patton's advance was halted not primarily by German resistance but by American logistics. The second interruption came from Allied command priorities. General Eisenhower allocated supply priority to Field Marshal Montgomery's airborne thrust toward Arnhem, the operation that became Market Garden, and failed at the Rhine Bridge on September 17. Patton watched a campaign that might have reached the Rhine slow to a halt on empty fuel gauges and orders he could not override. He was furious. He was also, for those 5 days, unable to do the one thing that made him operationally dangerous. The German force that reconstituted itself on the Moselle during those 5 days was a patchwork, but not a rabble. The German First Army under Knobelsdorff held the line from Sedan in the north to Epinal in the south, with a collection of units that ran the full range of what the German army could still produce in September 1944. At Metz, the fortress ring was held by a mix of officer cadets pulled from the city's service schools, Luftwaffe field regiments whose ground combat training was minimal, and the 17th SS, Panzer Grenadier Division Gotz von Berlichingen, a formation with genuine combat experience that had nonetheless been severely mauled in Normandy and was still rebuilding its strength. North of Nancy at Pont-à-Mousson, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, transferred from Italy in August, and one of the most capable formations in the German order of battle, provided the most coherent professional infantry defense Third Army would face on the Moselle. The 553rd Volksgrenadier Division held Nancy itself, one of the new formations raised under Hitler's emergency program, better organized than the improvisations of August, but with no combat experience to test its doctrine against reality. This was the force Patton was driving into when fuel came. Not a beaten army, but not a solid one either. To understand what happened in the next 8 days, you have to understand the command system that was trying to hold that line. The German army had been refining a command philosophy called Auftragstaktik since the era of Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke the Elder in the 1860s, and by 1944, it had been polished into its finest form. The principle is simple to state and genuinely difficult to execute. A senior commander gives a subordinate 2 things, and only 2 things. The mission, meaning the specific objective, and the intent, meaning the reason behind the objective and what the higher commander is ultimately trying to accomplish. He does not prescribe how the subordinate should achieve it. The subordinate, who is physically closer to the friction and fog of the actual battlefield, determines the method. The 1933 German Army Field Manual, the Truppenführung, stated the underlying logic directly. The first criterion in war remains decisive action. Inaction and neglect incriminate an officer more seriously than any error in the choice of means. What this produced in practice was an officer corps trained to function 2 echelons above their own rank. A German company commander was expected to fight a regiment. A battalion commander was expected to run a division. Every officer, from the most senior field marshal to the most junior lieutenant, was trained to look at a collapsing situation, identify the commanding officer's intent, even in the absence of direct orders, and act on that intent independently and immediately. The system was specifically designed to survive exactly the conditions that destroy most armies. Lost communications, dead commanders, plans that fall apart in the first 30 minutes of contact with the enemy. It had worked brilliantly. Poland in 1939, France in 1940, the Balkans, the opening months of Barbarossa. Against every opponent the German army faced in 5 years of war, Auftragstaktik produced the ability to reconstitute shattered formations, redirect blunted attacks, and exploit enemy hesitation faster than any opponent could respond. You can see it working at its best in the same campaign that would break it. When the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division stopped the first American crossing attempt at Pont-à-Mousson on September 5th, its regimental commanders had positioned their own forces without detailed orders from division, read the ground correctly, and produced a defense the Americans could not penetrate without changing their entire approach. The system functioned at the small unit level, even when the operational level above it was struggling. What it could not do, because no system in the world could do it, was process information fast enough at army and corps level to respond to a threat that had already moved past the position being defended. Auftragstaktik had a hidden assumption buried so deeply inside its own logic that no German staff college had ever needed to examine it, because no enemy had forced the examination before Lorraine. The assumption was tempo. Mission tactics work when the situation a subordinate observes, orients to, decides upon, and acts against is still recognizably the same situation when his action lands. The system was designed to handle friction, the normal confusion and delay that makes military planning unreliable. What it was not designed to handle was an opponent whose pace of movement was consistently faster than the complete cycle of observation, decision, and execution inside the German chain of command. If your best-trained officers are making the right calls on yesterday's battlefield while the enemy moves through tomorrow's, you are not winning. You are producing disciplined, well-executed responses to a situation that no longer exists. This gap between the 2 command cycles is measurable in the historical record. A significant American action at corps or army level in Lorraine in September took between 6 and 12 hours to produce a usable contact report at Knobelsdorff's 1st Army headquarters. Given the degradation of German telephone landlines by Allied tactical air operations, his staff then prepared a response and referred it upward through Army Group G. Decisions involving armoured reserves frequently required Hitler's personal approval, and the approval process ran through an evening situation conference in East Prussia that rarely concluded before midnight, adding between 12 and 24 hours to the loop. Movement orders then travelled back down the chain. Units had to be assembled, briefed, and moved to contact, often under the constant threat of American fighter bombers. From the moment something significant happened in 3rd Army's sector, the German command needed between 36 and 72 hours to produce a coherent operational response. Patton's loop was running in 6 to 12 hours. He pushed his daily army-level guidance down to corps and division every morning by telephone, frequently before breakfast. His corps commanders, Major General Manton Eddy at the 12th Corps and Major General Walton Walker at the 20th Corps, operated with the latitude to act on intent without referring upward for approval. The 4th Armoured Division had been trained for years to fight on the commander's intent without waiting for formal written orders, and Patton's air partner, Brigadier General Otto Weyland, commanding the 19th Tactical Air Command, had his forward headquarters physically co-located with Patton's own, meaning an American tank crew in contact could have P-47 Thunderbolts overhead inside the time it took Knobelsdorff's staff to draft a reaction order and have it approved. Colonel Bruce Clarke recalled the exchange that defined how 3rd Army actually functioned. He once told Patton he kept running out of orders by mid-morning because Corps could not issue guidance fast enough to match the pace of the advance. Patton's entire reply was 2 words: go east. Clarke went 500 miles on those 2 words. The gap between 36 hours and 6 hours is not a gap in courage or tactical skill or quality of equipment. It is a gap in time. And in Lorraine, in September 1944, a gap in time was enough to decide battles. The clearest early illustration is a village called Mary, 5 days before Jodl, on the night of September 7th to 8th. With 3rd Army temporarily halted by the fuel shortage, and the American 90th Infantry Division still organizing its crossing preparations north of Thionville, Knobelsdorff saw what looked like an opportunity. He had one operational mobile reserve, the 106th Panzer Brigade, a newly formed unit under Colonel Franz Balck. Balck held the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of the highest decorations the German army could award. Earned on the Eastern Front by commanding scratch formations that held off Soviet armoured assaults under extreme pressure. He was experienced, highly decorated, and not a man who made obvious tactical errors. The brigade he commanded had 47 Panthers, a Panzer Grenadier battalion, and roughly 6 weeks of existence as a formed unit. Many of its crews had never fired a combined gunnery exercise together before deployment. Knobelsdorff committed the brigade with Hitler's personal authorization, on the explicit condition that it be returned to Army Reserve within 48 hours. No unit verified where the 90th Division's forward elements actually were that night, compared to where the previous day's intelligence said they should be. The brigade moved in 2 columns in darkness and rain, with no air reconnaissance because the Luftwaffe in the west had by this point ceased to function as a meaningful operational force. In the early hours of September 8th, the lead German column ran directly into the bivouac of the 90th Division's artillery and tank destroyer positions at close range. A confused, violent close-quarters battle erupted in the dark. American tank destroyers fired illumination rounds. German Panthers, designed to kill at 1,500 meters with superior optics, found themselves in a brawl at under 100 meters where those advantages counted for nothing. When daylight came, the 2nd German column was spotted moving up a sunken road west of Mary by an American forward artillery observer. He called a fire mission. More than 300 rounds of 105mm howitzer fire fell on a stationary column in approximately 20 minutes. When surviving vehicles attempted to withdraw, infantry regiments of the 90th Division had already moved during the night to block the retreat route. The 106th Panzer Brigade, Knobelsdorff's only operational armoured reserve, was effectively destroyed in a single day. German losses at Mary were approximately 30 tanks and 60 half-tracks, with several hundred men taken prisoner. What matters about Mary is not the specific numbers, it is the mechanism of failure. The plan was not foolish, Knobelsdorff was not careless, Balck was not an incompetent commander. The brigade was executing an attack built on a picture of the 90th Division's positions that had been accurate when the intelligence was gathered, and that had been replaced by a different reality before the orders arrived. The 90th Division had moved. Its artillery had repositioned. The ground, the Germans expected to find, was occupied by a force in a configuration German command had not yet processed. They were executing a Day 1 plan on Day 3. Patton's army had moved through Day 2 while the orders were still being typed. Now carry that understanding 5 days forward, and east along the Moselle to Jodl. Major General Manton Eddy's 12th Corps had attempted a direct crossing at Pont-à-Mousson on September 5th. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division stopped it cleanly. Eddy did not attempt the same crossing again. He shifted axes entirely. Combat Command B of the 4th Armoured crossed the Moselle to the south at Bayonne on September 11th, hitting the boundary between 2 German units where coordination was thinnest. Simultaneously, the 80th Infantry Division's main effort shifted to Jodl, where assault boats crossed the river in darkness on the night of September 11th to 12th, and American combat engineers had a treadway bridge in place before dawn. Hugh Cole's official army history records that German intelligence in the days before the crossing concentrated exclusively on signs of coming American attacks at Metz and south of Nancy. The Jodl sector was not flagged as a priority. No local reserves were moved toward it. The assessment was logically derived from the information available to German headquarters. It was wrong because the information described a situation Eddy had already replaced with a different one. On September 13th, Colonel Bruce Clarke led Combat Command A through the Dieulouard bridgehead, hit a German counterattack already in progress from elements of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division, drove straight through it, and by nightfall had driven approximately 45 miles into the German rear, overrunning the headquarters responsible for coordinating Nancy's defence and reaching positions near Château Salins. The following day, Combat Command A pushed further to the high ground around Arracourt, while Combat Command B completed its encirclement of Nancy from the south. By the morning of September 15th, the two commands had linked up east of the city. The 553rd Volksgrenadier Division defending Nancy found itself surrounded without warning and broke out to the southeast across country. Nancy fell without the house-to-house fighting that had been anticipated. The entire German defensive scheme for the Nancy sector was rendered obsolete in 48 hours. At every point in those 2 days, the orders being drafted at Knobelsdorff's headquarters were addressed to a battlefield that had already changed. Reinforcements dispatched to strengthen the Dieulouard shoulder were dispatched after Clarke had already broken out of it. Units ordered to hold the road to Château Salins received those orders after Clarke's tanks had already passed through. The command structure responsible for Nancy was overrun before 1st Army headquarters knew it was threatened. Knobelsdorff was not making poor decisions. He was making reasonable decisions on information that had been replaced by events his command cycle had not yet processed. The men Hitler sent to fix this were formidable. General Hasso von Manteuffel, given the 5th Panzer Army and directed personally by Hitler to destroy the 12th Corps bridgehead and retake Luneville, was one of the most gifted operational commanders Germany still possessed in the West. 5 feet 3 inches tall, ferociously energetic, a former cavalry and armour officer who had commanded the 7th Panzer Division on the Eastern Front and then the elite Grossdeutschland Division, Manteuffel was the kind of commander who led from the front alongside his tanks. His reputation had been built on 2 defining operations. In late November 1943, his 7th Panzer Division recaptured Zhytomyr in Ukraine, saving an encircled German formation and earning him the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross. In April 1944, at Târgu Frumos in Romania, his Grossdeutschland division repelled a massive Soviet armoured offensive, defeating a force that outnumbered his own several times over. He was given the 5th Panzer Army on September 1, 1944. He received 2 new panzer brigades for the Lorraine counterattack, the 111th and the 113th, plus the 11th Panzer Division and supporting Panzer Grenadier formations. On paper, his armoured strength totaled 262 tanks and assault guns, 75 Panzer IVs, 107 Panthers, and 80 self-propelled assault guns. Hitler had ordered these new panzer brigades raised specifically to stop the Allied advance, each designed to provide a rapid, hard-hitting mobile reserve that could be concentrated quickly at a threatened point. The concept was sound. The execution exposed the fundamental problem of building a formation faster than you can train it. In practice, the panzer brigades were, as subsequent post-war accounts described them, barrel scrapings. Fresh panthers with barely trained crews, minimal signals integration above company level, and in many vehicles no radios capable of coordination between tanks and their accompanying infantry under fire. They had the right equipment and had been hollowed out by the pace of their own formation, assembled faster than the training needed to make them effective. Manteuffel's plan assumed Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured was deployed at or near Luneville in a forward screen. Colonel Clarke had instead positioned Combat Command A on low ridges near the village of Arracourt that he had personally selected for their reverse slopes, their concealment, and the commanding fields of fire they offered across the approaches the Germans would have to use. When the 111th Panzer Brigade attacked at dawn on September 18th into Luneville itself, it hit the 4th Armoured's Reserve Command and the 2nd Mechanized Cavalry Reconnaissance Group, not the main American force, was stopped with more than 24 armoured vehicles lost, and the follow-on thrust toward Arracourt ran into positions German intelligence had never located. On September 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade struck directly at Combat Command A's positions near Arracourt and lost 43 tanks in a single day, the great majority of them Panthers. Over the next 11 days, Manteuffel mounted 5 separate major assaults. Dense autumn fog blanketed the Saar Valley during the first and most critical engagements, and the fog made a decisive contribution. It stripped the Panther of its primary tactical advantage, the superior optics and longer-range main gun that made it genuinely dangerous at the distances where German doctrine called for it to fight. Clarke's Shermans, fighting from concealed reverse-slope positions, engaged at close range where the American 75mm M3 gun was entirely adequate. When the fog lifted, Brigadier General Weyland's 19th Tactical Air Command put P-47 Thunderbolts over German columns within hours. The 4th Armoured 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the fast M18 Hellcat, covered the flanks and caught German columns that had lost tactical awareness in the fog and rain. The mathematics of those losses deserve a moment of attention, because they run against the popular understanding of the Sherman tank versus the Panther. The Panther was by nearly every technical measure a superior vehicle. Its 75mm L-70 gun outranged the American 75mm M3. Its frontal armor was effectively immune to the standard Sherman gun at normal combat ranges. On paper, a panzer brigade of Panthers attacking an equal number of Shermans in open terrain should have achieved a favorable exchange ratio. At Arracourt, the ratio ran the other way. The combination of fog that eliminated the Panther's range advantage, reverse slopes that eliminated its frontal armor advantage, a trained and rested formation fighting on ground it had chosen, and air support that arrived faster than the German command could respond to it, turned every technical advantage of the Panther into an irrelevance. The Germans were not fighting the battle they had prepared for. They were fighting the battle Clarke had set for them. On ground and terms Clarke's faster decision cycle had selected before Manteufels could respond. By the end of September, of the 262 German tanks and assault guns committed at Arracourt, 86 had been permanently destroyed, 114 were damaged or broken down, and only 62 remained operational. The 4th Armoured Division lost 41 Sherman tanks and 7 light tanks for the entire month. 225 American soldiers were killed, and 648 were wounded. Arracourt was the largest American armoured engagement in the European theatre before the Battle of the Bulge. Inside Manteuffel's headquarters during those 11 days, the pattern was consistent. Manteufel could see from the front that his brigades were being destroyed in conditions his men could not overcome. He sent General Blaskowitz an accurate assessment and requested permission to withdraw to a shorter, more defensible line. Cole's official history records that Blaskowitz sent back a short tactical lecture and an order to counterattack. The German command system was processing a situation its own frontline commander had already accurately diagnosed. On September 21st, Blaskowitz was relieved. His replacement was General Hermann Balck, the finest operational commander the German army could still put in the field in the West. Balck had earned his reputation on the Eastern Front, most notably commanding the 11th Panzer Division at the Chir River in December 1942, where his division virtually destroyed the Soviet 5th Tank Army in a series of mobile counterattacks that military historians have since analyzed as among the most skillful divisional-level operations of the entire war. His chief of staff at Army Group G would be General Friedrich von Mellenthin, who had served as the intelligence staff officer at Rommel's Afrika Korps headquarters in North Africa from June 1941 to September 1942, and had then served as Chief of Staff of the 48th Panzer Corps on the Eastern Front from November 1942 to May 1944. The commander of the 48th Panzer Corps during the Kursk battles of July 1943 had been Knobelsdorff himself. Balck took over the corps in December 1943, and it was during those final months in Ukraine that Balck and Mellenthin first forged the working relationship they would bring to Army Group G. Together, they were arguably the most capable command partnership the German army could assemble in the West in the autumn of 1944. Mellenthin would later write in his memoir, Panzer Battles, that when Balck arrived and assessed the situation, the conclusion was plain. If Patton had been given a free hand at that moment, with the West Wall still unmanned and no effective reserve defence prepared, he might well have driven through to the Saar and the Rhine. That Patton was not given that free hand was, from the German perspective, the result of Allied supply constraints and command decisions, not of German defensive skill. Balck and Mellenthin were professionals. They knew the difference. Patton was not given that free hand. The October rains arrived on the Moselle. The Vosges Mountains closed the southern flank. And Metz, whose ring of forts built between 1870 and 1914 had never been reduced by direct assault in any previous war, absorbed 4 full divisions of Walker's 20th Corps for 3 months of some of the most costly and least effective fighting Third Army conducted in the European campaign. General Blaskowitz said after the war that a direct attack on Metz had been unnecessary and that the fortress area could have been masked and bypassed, collapsing the German First Army's right flank without a siege. He was not alone in that assessment. This is where the honest account holds 2 things in tension simultaneously. The same campaign that contains the most complete demonstration of decision cycle dominance the American Army achieved in the European theatre also contains one of Patton's most criticized operational decisions. Both are part of the record. The difference between them is not courage or aggression or tactical skill. The difference is speed. When Third Army was moving faster than the German command could track it, the results were Mary, Dieulouard, Nancy, and Arracourt. When Third Army slowed to the pace of fortress siege operations and gave the German command system time to breathe, the results were 3 months of grinding, costly stalemate. Balck saw this with precision. In a taped conversation recorded at the Battelle Tactical Technology Center in Ohio on April 13, 1979, he told his American interviewer directly that within his zone, the Americans never once exploited a success, and that he and Mellenthin would stand in front of the map and say that Patton was helping them by failing again to exploit an opening. That statement deserves space in any honest account of Lorraine. It confirms that what Patton demonstrated in September was not an accident of terrain or weather. It was a specific operational capability, and when the conditions that enabled it were removed, even the finest operational commander in the Allied forces in Western Europe could be fought to a draw by a German command system that, given time, was still formidably capable. Now, consider what the German commanders who faced Patton actually said, because the record has layers that the popular version flattens. General Gunther Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff at Oberbefehlshaber West under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, wrote in a post-war study prepared for the United States Army Foreign Military Studies program that German command regarded Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action who came closest to their own concept of the classical military commander. General Heinz Guderian, after his own capture, told Allied interrogators that from the standpoint of a tank specialist, he had to congratulate Patton for his victory, because Patton had acted as Guderian himself would have done in his place. Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations staff throughout the war, told American interrogators in 1945 that Patton was the American Guderian, very bold, preferring large movements, taking big risks, and winning big successes. Read those assessments carefully. They are not simply personal praise. They are German officers recognizing in Patton's operational method exactly what their own doctrine had identified as the highest form of military action. The ability to place the next blow before the enemy had finished reacting to the last one, making the enemy's plan obsolete before he could execute it. When Blumentritt called Patton the closest Allied approximation to the German classical commander, he was describing the same phenomenon that had just broken the German command system at Mary and Nancy and Arracourt. Then read Balck's April 1979 assessment again, and the picture becomes complete. The man who actually fought Patton in October and November saw a different opponent from the one the August and September record produced. He saw a commander who stopped exploiting successes, attacked fixed fortifications frontally rather than bypassing them, and gave German command the time it needed to recover. Both testimonies are truthful. They describe 2 different phases of the same campaign, separated by the fuel, weather, and command decisions that stripped Third Army of its one decisive quality. The deeper question is what the experience of being defeated by Patton's September tempo revealed about the nature of modern warfare, not just about one campaign in Lorraine. Between January and April 1979, Pierre Spray, of the Battelle Tactical Technology Center in Columbus, Ohio, conducted a series of taped interviews with Balck and Mellenthin about tactics and command philosophy. Those transcripts went directly into the work of Colonel John Boyd of the United States Air Force. Boyd was then developing the theoretical framework he called patterns of conflict, built around the idea that the side which can observe, orient, decide, and act faster than its opponent generates in that opponent a condition of confusion, mistrust, and paralysis that no amount of training or firepower can overcome from the inside. Boyd had arrived at this insight through his analysis of jet fighter combat over Korea. He found in the Balck and Mellenthin interviews a confirmation of the same principle at the level of ground operations and entire armies. In May 1980, the BDM Corporation hosted a 4-day colloquium in McLean, Virginia, under contract from the Director of Net Assessment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Balck and Mellenthin spent 4 days with senior American officers working through the implications of the Eastern Front experience for future conventional warfare. At one point, asked to illustrate the tempo at which decisions had to be made in mobile armored combat, Mellenthin told the American participants that on the Eastern Front, his headquarters normally had about 5 minutes to make such decisions. That remark, recorded in the BDM Corporation's technical report, published in December 1980, became one of the most discussed passages in the American military reform literature of that decade. When Balck was asked directly what he considered most difficult to defend against, terrain or speed, his answer was a single word: speed. The doctrinal work that followed drew directly on those conversations. The 1982 edition of the United States Army Field Manual 100-5, AirLand Battle, was drafted by Lieutenant Colonels Huber Was de Chege and L.D. Holder under General Don Starry at the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. It codified 4 core tenets: initiative, depth, agility, and synchronization. It drew explicitly on German operational concepts, on the lessons of the 1967 and 1973 Arab-Israeli wars, and on the synthesis Boyd and the military reform movement had built from years of German post-war interviews and analysis. The Lorraine campaign did not drive AirLand Battle by itself, but the conversations it generated between German generals and American officers across 3.5 decades ran beneath every discussion that produced that doctrine. 9 years later, in March of 1989, the United States Marine Corps published Fleet Marine Force Manual 1, Warfighting, signed by Commandant General Alfred M. Gray and drafted by Captain John Schmidt. The decision cycle and mission command stood at the absolute center of that document. It was superseded in 1997 by Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, also titled Warfighting, also drafted by John Schmidt, which remains the capstone doctrine of the United States Marine Corps today. The intellectual line from the Moselle in September 1944 to McLean, Virginia, in May of 1980, to Quantico in 1989, ran through a consistent core insight. You do not beat the enemy by outgunning him at the point of contact. You beat him by completing your next move before his command system can process what your last move did to him. Understanding why Third Army's loop ran so fast requires one more look at the man running it. Patton's personal command style was not administrative. He flew forward in his L-4 Piper Cub liaison aircraft nearly every morning, sometimes landing on farm roads, to see the ground himself. He reached Corps and Division headquarters before noon, in time to redirect the day's operations before the German command cycle had processed the previous night's contact reports. When Third Army's staff proposed a formal daily briefing schedule, Patton told them he did not want a briefing, he wanted results, and that he would find out what was happening by going there. This was not theatre. It compressed his own observation and decision cycle to a degree that no German commander at Army level was attempting. Nobelsdorf was working from maps and radio reports in a command post. Patton was looking at the same ground his division commanders were looking at, often within hours of the leading elements. The effect on Third Army's tempo was structural. Orders did not wait for the formal morning briefing. They went out as the situation developed, not as it was reconstructed hours later from filtered staff summaries. George Patton never read John Boyd. He died on December 21, 1945, at the United States Army's 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, 12 days after sustaining severe injuries in an automobile accident on the outskirts of Mannheim. He was 60 years old. He left no theoretical treatise on operational tempo. He was an intuitive practitioner, not a theorist. He believed, as he told his staff throughout the summer of 1944, that a good plan violently executed now was better than a perfect plan executed next week. He had no patience for commanders who stopped to consolidate when consolidating gave the enemy time to recover. He never gave the principle a name. The German officers who faced him and survived spent the next 30 years supplying the framework in interview rooms and memoir chapters and colloquia in American cities trying to explain to a new generation of officers what it had felt like to be inside a command system that could not think fast enough. The Lorraine campaign from September through December 1944 cost Third Army 55,182 combat casualties, 6,657 killed, 36,406 wounded, 12,119 missing. The historian Carlo D'Este, in his authoritative biography of Patton, called Lorraine one of Patton's least successful campaigns. The Combat Studies Institute's 1985 monograph on the campaign was openly critical of the decision to assault Metz frontally rather than bypass it. Blaskowitz said after the war that the decision was unnecessary. These criticisms are in the historical record and they belong there. They do not cancel what happened in September. They complete the picture. There is something worth sitting with in that picture. The German army that met Patton in September 1944 was not an army in collapse. Its junior officers were among the best trained in the world. Its soldiers were battle-hardened. Its command doctrine was intellectually superior to anything the Allies had produced in equivalent form. Knobelsdorff was a genuine panzer professional. Manteuffel was brilliant. Balck and Mellenthin were, by the assessment of military historians on every side, as close to the ideal of the operational commander as the 20th century produced. And none of it was sufficient for those 8 days in September against an opponent whose orders were consistently arriving before the situation they described had changed. The lesson is not that the American army was simply better. The lesson is that even the finest command system in the world has a tempo limit. Push an opponent past that limit, and his training, his doctrine, and his experience become liabilities rather than assets, because they generate confident action on information that is already obsolete. Those 8 days at Mary and Doullens and Nancy and Arracourt are why Blumentritt wrote what he wrote, why Guderian said he would have done the same, and why Balck and Mellenthin flew to Ohio in 1979 and to Virginia in 1980 to tell American officers that speed was harder to defend against than terrain. And that distinction between being better and being faster is what the doctrine those conversations produced still teaches today. If this story reached you, please hit the like button before you move on. It is the single most effective thing you can do to help this channel reach the audience these stories deserve. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a grandfather, a great-uncle, someone who came home and never talked about what they saw, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those stories deserves to be in this conversation. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.